Alright guys, it's Jerningham here. Coronavirus, COVID-19, all settings in the UK has risen by 245 today to 41,128 deaths in the UK. I don't know about Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, but we're going to press play in the video. So they're both talking here. Department of Health says the numbers of people who died. Phone will not stay there. We're trying to balance the phone, but it won't stay in the same fucking place. It's bloody annoying. Oh, this is really getting on my nerves, this phone is.
The PM was talking about Mr. Hancock, the Health Secretary, having more to say about that tomorrow. Next week, Mr. Williamson, the former Defence Secretary, the Education Secretary, is going to say more about getting more children back into schools. So today, the PM came to a news
UK
conference
extends
hope with some good news.
did lockdown earlier to total numbers of deaths.
About two things: schools and also those comments by Professor Neil Ferguson about the timing of the lockdown.
Okay, John, thanks for taking us through it all. John Craig there, our chief political correspondent, and just to remind you, at 9:30, we're going to be showing the announcements from this afternoon's Downing Street COVID-19 briefing by the Prime Minister. Now, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, has warned that the UK will suffer the biggest slump of any country in the developed world as a result of coronavirus. It forecast that national income would fall by more than 11% this year. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, told our economics editor Ed Conway that the government had been faced with an unprecedented challenge, but they did have a plan to reopen the economy. Here's Ed's report on that warning of the growth.
Doing everything he can to get the economy going again.
Back in the shops in haberdashery to start.
Today, the Chancellor helping prepare this branch of John Lewis for its reopening. The lockdown, he says, is now a danger, not just to the economy, but to our health.
Brilliant. Only one bubble. People have not been able to go and get the healthcare treatment that they need. Children have not been at schools. People are suffering from increased mental health or isolation. I personally think every day our children are not at school is a tragedy. It's obviously going to have an impact on their futures. When we moved our stuff, somehow we've lost our pizza slicer in the move, so she dispatched me to get one.
The Chancellor, who has just moved his family into Downing Street, is ready to go out shopping. The key question is whether the rest of us are. A question John Lewis's new boss is asking herself.
It's the right question. I mean, we've all been, so many of us have been, coping at home for the last, 2 or 3 months, and we are going to provide, I think, a really safe environment for customers to feel confident shopping. it's still going to be a great experience. So for us, we're safe, not fast.
Do you remember George Osborne wearing his high-vis jacket and hard hat? That was a constant theme of his chancellorship. He was out there showing the manufacturing sector going, the march of the makers. Well, in a sense, we're now beginning to see the Rishi Sunak equivalent. And it is, well, what you've just seen, him out there in the shops showing that it's safe to go and spend. And why is that? It's because the Treasury is desperately concerned that lockdown's coming to an end. It's pressing all these buttons to restart the economy. But if people don't spend, then who knows when the recovery is going to happen. And as if you needed evidence of why this matters, check out the latest economic numbers from the OECD. The economic organisation saying if there's a single wave of the virus, Britain could face the biggest hit of any major nation, with GDP down 11.5% this year. And that's not even the worst case scenario.
This discussion between lives and livelihoods is a totally false dilemma. You go, you throw everything you got, including the kitchen sink, at the virus. You beat it. You beat the enemy, and that will make it less expensive to actually get back on your feet.
Of course, the virus is not the only crisis exercising the Chancellor. The protests on the streets of British and American cities in recent weeks over racism and police brutality have also caused some concern.
As a British Asian, of course I know that racism exists in our country. It stings in a way that very few other things have stung me. And I know people are angry, they're upset, and they want to see change.
This is certainly a changing country in all sorts of respects. The question worrying the Chancellor now is whether the lockdown is causing any lasting side effects to society, to families, and to the economy. Ed Conway, Sky News.
And we're going to be showing an extended version of that interview with the Chancellor at 7:30. Now, George Floyd's brother has appealed to the US Congress to stop the pain over police brutality. In an emotional statement, Phineas Floyd said that his brother called for help and was ignored, and the same call was now ringing out around the world.
George's name means something. You have the opportunity here today to make your names mean something too. If his death ends up changing the world for the better, and I think it will, then he died as he lived. It is on you to make sure his death is not in vain.
Let's get more on that. Our US correspondent Greg Milam joins me now. So, Greg, what was the response from Congress to that appeal from Mr. Floyd?
Well, there have been a lot of words from members of Congress, as you would expect, promising action, but what he took to them in a remarkable moment, really, was a very direct plea for help. I'm asking you to make it stop, this pain, he said. Please listen to the call. And it really took those protests that have been going on for weeks in America right to the doorstep of America's politicians and demanded of them that they take action, real action, and they take it quickly. We've seen noises from both parties about plans to address the issue of police brutality and racial profiling, but there's an impatience for that to be turned into action, and it will be very difficult to ignore such an image like that of George Floyd's brother in front of members of Congress making such a powerful plea 24 hours after laying his brother to rest. But what we're also seeing across the country is action that is being taken at a local level. They're not waiting for the politicians in Washington. And in Minneapolis, of course, where all of this started with the death of George Floyd, the police chief there announcing that he's withdrawn from negotiations with the police union, a very powerful police union, until they can reach agreement on things like use of force, officers being rehired once they've been sacked from the job for any reason. This is what the police chief in Minneapolis has said today.
Beginning today, as chief, I am immediately withdrawing from the contract negotiations with the Minneapolis Police Federation. I plan to bring in subject matter experience and advisors to conduct a thorough review of how the contract can be restructured to provide greater community transparency and more flexibility for true reform.
And that's what we're seeing. Of course, the city council in Minneapolis has already voted to disband the police force and start all over again. Bans on things like chokeholds, looking at disciplinary procedures are happening in police forces here in Houston and around the country, but they are looking for leadership and legislation coming from Washington. And of course, the country's waiting to hear what the president might be willing to do, and some suggesting he is now looking at a series of options, maybe an executive order to address some of these issues regarding the police, but he has said he believes
It's in
there's
Houston,
not a systemic problem of racism in the police.
America,
Which a lot of people
the
across
D
America
News channel the guy is on.
Many thanks. Greg Marland there. Now, here in the UK, a series of demonstrations took place just over an hour ago to show support for the Black Lives Matter movement. These were the scenes in Bristol, York, London and Glasgow when protesters gathered to take a knee at 6 o'clock this evening for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That, of course, is the amount of time that George Floyd was held down by a police officer. And just to let you know, we're broadcasting a special programme next Tuesday on the issues behind the protests, racism in society, and how to confront it. So we're going to be joined by leading figures from across the black community, historians,
245.
activists, business and cultural leaders for race and revolution. Is change going to come? And you can be part of it as well. If you'd like to be in our virtual audience and maybe put a question to the panel, please email newsdebates@sky.uk. Now, the prime suspect in the Madeleine McCann case has been moved into a single cell for his own safety. Convicted sex offender Christian B is currently in jail in Germany, where he's being investigated over other unsolved crimes against children. Our crime correspondent, Martin Brunt, reports.
This is suspect Christian B and a former girlfriend who's said to have reported him to police for beating her up. Naxiesh Miftari has vanished from her German home. Her family said she's in hiding. In Kiel jail, Christian B has been moved into a single cell for his own safety. The prime suspect in the Madeleine McCann case was well known in the town of Braunschweig.
My heart was broken when I saw the picture from Christian B. From this kiosk.
Brigitte Zegedi ran the bar next to the suspect's corner shop kiosk.
Wie das erste Foto von Christian, das ging durch meinen ganzen Körper. Ich wünsche mir für die Eltern, für die Familie, der Fall muss geklärt werden. Sie müssen genau wissen, soll bitte genau sagen, dass die Eltern wissen, wo das Kind ist.
Klaus-Peter Erdmann is the caretaker of a nearby apartment block.
Hier sind mal morgens die Kinder angekommen zu mir und haben gesagt, wir waren bei Christian und haben Geschenke bekommen. Und dann bin ich mal hin, ich sage, oh Christian, die Kinder freuen sich immer, du kriegst, die kriegen Geschenke. Ja, sagt er, immer so kleine Kaugummi oder Gummibärchen.
The German prosecutor says there's evidence Madeleine is dead, but he won't say what it is. Madeleine vanished from her family's holiday apartment in Portugal 13 years ago. Convicted child sex abuser Christian B is the prime suspect for Madeleine, but police are reopening files on more unsolved cases. Victims such as German teenager Carola Tietze, whose body washed up on a Belgian beach 24 years ago.
Now we have decided, together with the prosecutor, to reopen the case and review the things that we can find.
British student nurse Louise Curtin vanished in Germany 19 years ago.
Initial reports of these Christians' activities cover quite a wide geographical range and a range of ages. I'm torn between contacting the police force directly and perhaps going through the consul.
Every day, the suspicions around the suspect are growing. Martin Brunt, Sky News in Braunschweig, Germany.
And the investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann likely to be covered in the papers tomorrow. We're taking a first look at the front pages in our press preview at 10:30 with the consultant editor of the Daily Mail, Andrew Pearce, and the associate editor of the Daily Mirror, Kevin Maguire. Now that boxing fans can start looking forward to the biggest ever fight between two British boxers. A deal has been struck for Anthony Joshua to fight Tyson Fury for the undisputed heavyweight championship of the world. Joshua's promoter, Eddie Hearn, tells Sky News that contracts have not been signed, but both sides have agreed to the financial terms.
The biggest fight in British boxing history has just been agreed. Get him there, my boy! two-fight deal. Tyson Fury versus Anthony Joshua next year.
Well, he's excited. Let's speak to our sports correspondent, Martha Candler, who's also excited, I suppose. And I mean, a lot of boxing bouts are overhyped, not this one.
No, this is very big indeed, and as you mentioned, it's a fight that many boxing fans have been waiting several years to hear that is on the cards now. And when it does happen, it will be billed as the biggest fight in British boxing history. There's no doubt about that, and that is understandable because Anthony Joshua is a megastar of the sport. He's at the very top of his game. He holds 3 of those world heavyweight title belts, while Tyson Fury holds the other one. So this is the chance, in its simplest terms, to see who is the very best heavyweight fighter in the world. But so far they've never met in the ring, but that is about to change. The boxing promoter Eddie Hearn telling Sky Sports earlier on that a deal had been reached, and I think we can hear a little bit of what Eddie had to say.
It's the biggest fight ever in British boxing. It's 2 British heavyweight world champions fighting for the undisputed heavyweight world championship. So it doesn't get any bigger than that. And there will never be a bigger fight, I don't think, probably in our generation, to be quite honest with you. And you've got 2 guys, you know, both very different, you know, both fight differently, both experience different things in their career, both come back from adversity at one stage or the other. And I just think it's got everything.
Well, Martha, everyone's appetite's been well and truly whetted, but we want to know when and where.
Well, it's a 2-fight deal that's been struck, and we think the first time that they'll fight will be in the summer of 2021, depending, of course, on what happens with the coronavirus and if it's able to be staged with fans, which will, of course, be the overwhelming wish of the fight promoters. The big question is, where will this fight be held? My understanding is that promoters from Saudi Arabia were over in London just before the coronavirus shutdown, speaking to Anthony Joshua's team and expressing their wish that they would host this fight. They'd clearly be a controversial host on human rights grounds, but they did host Anthony Joshua's most recent fight against the American-Mexican Andy Ruiz. You'd also think that Wembley would be in the frame, perhaps Cardiff, or maybe even Las Vegas, which of course hosted many of the biggest fights in boxing history. Both men do have to fight before that, not insignificantly for Tyson Fury. He faces the man known as the Bronze Bomber, Deontay Wilder, who's an incredibly dangerous prospect. But as Tyson Fury was saying rather breathlessly earlier, this fight against Anthony Joshua is the big one. It's the one boxing fans have all been waiting for.
Sure, watch this space, Martha. Thank you very much indeed. And you're watching Sky News Tonight. Coming up.
Just hold on and suck in.
Gone from view. How films like Gone with the Wind are being removed from screens because of their portrayal of black characters.
party.
I'm having a party, a girls' party. Yay, where are your drinks, girls?
It is nothing short, but an amazing day today.
I wake up, sleep, eat, wake up, sleep, eat.
My name's Tony Nicholson. I'm a fitness coach and I'm an actor. Want some coffee? No. Want some coffee? No.
Now then, the film Gone with the Wind got 10 Oscars when it was released in 1939, and of course it's regarded as one of the greatest films ever made. But even at the time, its depiction of leading black characters being content with slavery was controversial. Well, now HBO Max has dropped the film from its streaming service, saying that these racist depictions were wrong then and are wrong today. Lucy Cotter reports on how the Black Lives Matter movement is challenging the entertainment industry.
The protests of recent times have moved far beyond the streets, and calls for change have now permeated throughout society, with culture, comedy, film and TV now under the spotlight.
Just hold on and suck it.
From the Civil War epic Gone with the Wind with its racist stereotypes, to Little Britain and its use of blackface characters, popular culture is being reassessed for what is now deemed inappropriate and should be pulled.
I know to some that, I don't know, pulling shows or pulling old movies might seem like a step too far, but ultimately I believe that art is the most powerful weapon in the world, that it shapes perceptions. And so, for instance, if you create characters, i.e. if you demonize black males in narratives time and time again, it moves from a stereotype into an archetype. And then an archetype just goes into our subconscious.
And for these young people, all drama enthusiasts, culture really does matter.
As a black person, seeing these caricatures and these stereotypes, it kind of forces you to be in a box. Like, you're black, you can only ever be this, you can ever be loud, or you can never be the kind of token friend.
People will compare you to different characters in movies, you know, obviously characters that aren't based off of anybody who's real. It's stereotype. The stereotypes can be very damaging to people. So me, myself, I've, like, a lot of stereotypes have been used against me, and it's obviously caused problems for me in my actual life. So I think it's I don't like seeing it on TV.
The sketch show Beau Selector has also been removed and criticised for being racist and outdated. Star Lee Francis has apologised, as have Anton Deck, for impersonating people of colour in an undercover segment of their show. But there are those who vehemently defend the freedom of comedians to offend and oppose any type of censorship, regardless of the material.
It's not designed to be politically correct, it's designed to be funny. If you can't take the mick out of each other and laugh at each other from time to time, what do we have left? We don't have freedom of speech and we don't have freedom of expression.
And while calls for a reappraisal of our cultural heritage continues, the debate over freedom and offence will also go on. Lucy Cotter, Sky News.
And this is Sky News Tonight. Coming up, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, talks about his experience of racism and getting people back into the shops after lockdown. You're watching Sky News Tonight. The top stories this evening, and the Prime Minister has defended the government's handling of the virus crisis after the scientist whose advice prompted the lockdown said deaths could have been halved if restrictions were introduced a week earlier. Mr Johnson has announced that adults living alone in England, including single parents with children under 18, will be able to form a so-called support bubble with one other household from this weekend. George Floyd's brother has called for the US Congress to stop the pain over police brutality. Now then, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has described his personal experience of racism, saying that it stings in a way that very few other things have. Speaking at a department store that's preparing to reopen, Mr Sunak also urged shoppers to return to the high street as more businesses open their doors in the coming weeks. And he sat down with our economics editor, Ed Conway.
Chancellor, here we are in a department store, and a lot of people will be looking and wondering how safe it is to get out there. You're probably looking at the economy and working out, you know, is it going to restart when you press the button? What's your sense of that particular question?
Well, we set out a plan some weeks ago for reopening our country slowly, getting our economy going, and we're executing to that plan. And the next stage of that plan is that we're able to open retail shops like this from next week, and we can do that because we set out 5 tests and we're meeting those 5 tests thanks to everyone's hard work, and I think that's a good thing. So yes, we will get going again and we can slowly start to get our lives back to normal, but it won't be the same. As we've been walking around this department store today, you've seen all the changes, the signs, the escalators, the screens, so people can come back to stores like this and shop in confidence, knowing that it is safe for them and their families, safe for the staff, and I think that's a very important first step. But these are deliberate, these are measured, and these are careful steps.
And why does that matter for the economy? Why does it matter for unemployment? Why does it matter for our livelihoods as we're coming out of lockdown?
Well, I think we all want a healthy country. We want to be able to, yes, go back to work, to the jobs that we love, but we also want to see our friends, our families, get our lives back to normal. And this lockdown, in many ways, has had lots of different costs. It's been necessary, but people have not been able to go and get the healthcare treatment that they need. Children have not been at schools. People are suffering from increased mental health or isolation. And yes, people, as you pointed out, are losing their jobs, and that's going to have an impact not just on their financial security, but on their long-term health as well. So I think, it is important now that we take our steps to rebuild our lives, but do so in a careful and measured way. And that's what we're here today to see.
And if we're not able to open up all the shops, open up all the pubs, open up all the hospitality, what are the consequences?
Well, if you're asking are there going to be severe consequences from this lockdown, then the answer is yes, and I've been very clear about that. It is going to have an impact on people's jobs and their livelihoods. That weighs very heavily.
And we need to prepare for that, for higher unemployment.
Well, I think first of all we should look at what we've done, and that's why I put in place the furlough scheme, which is now covering almost 9 million people. That's protected millions of jobs through this crisis, which is why it was so important. But looking forward, yes, there is going to be hardship ahead, but I want people to know that I will do absolutely everything I can to make sure they have the skills, the tools and the support they need to get back into hopefully an even better job as quickly as possible.
You talk about a plan. Are you happy with the way that plan has unfolded, with what has happened in the UK over the course of the past few months and the government's part in it?
Yes, I'm proud of what we've done. Obviously, we were faced with an unprecedented crisis.
Even though we have one of the worst death numbers, death tolls in the world, you're still proud of your record.
Chief Medical Officer has made this point many times, and I think he's right. I think there will be a time to look on all of this and reflect, and when it comes to numbers, I think that there are ways that he said are only really possible to compare and contrast after the fact when we have all the data in. So I think, and there will be a time for that, and of course we should do that and be self-aware about that.
We should ignore
of course we should ignore, but I think in order to make the comparisons that you're making, that we don't have all the data necessary to make those comparisons accurately at this point. But of course we should make them. No one is hiding from that fact. But if I look at the measures that we've put in place, in particular around supporting people people's jobs, their livelihoods through this difficult time, making sure that their families have the support they need, making sure businesses can stay together. I do think those are significant steps that have made a real difference to people's lives. And we do have a plan to reopen our country, reopen our economy now, and we are making progress on that plan. As I said, that's what we're here today to talk about. So you can see the plan is working, and stores like this will be open across the country from next week. That shows that we're making progress, and people should have confidence in that plan.
But with the benefit of hindsight, could it have gone a bit better?
Well, I've been very clear, as have other ministers been clear, when faced with something of this nature, completely unprecedented, both in terms of the scale and the speed in which it was happening, is it the case that every single thing that we got perfectly right first time? Of course that's not going to be the case. And I think most people would look at that and say, fair enough. But
is there anything in particular that you look at?
Are we doing? I mean, even in my own economic interventions, I've been, as you've known, we've been iterating as we go. The speed and the scale of which we've had to act has been unmatched, essentially, in modern time. So that means that I've had to change things as we go to make sure that the interventions that we put in place are getting to the people we want to get support to. And if that wasn't working first time round, then I've made changes that I need to make.
Okay, finally, Chancellor, obviously you'll have seen the protests in this country and in the US about Black Lives Matter, statues being pulled down. When you see that and when you kind of think through your own experience, what's your reaction?
As a British Asian, of course I know that racism exists in our country, and I know people are angry, they're upset, and they want to see change. But what I would also say is change doesn't come about through acts of vandalism or violence. That's not how you achieve real or lasting change. And what I would take a moment to recognise is, of course our story as a country isn't finished. It's a work in progress, and it always will be, and there's work to do. But I would take a moment to recognise the enormous progress we've made as a country from the time that my grandparents first arrived here, from the time that I was born and grew up. The work that has happened in the years before now has been tremendous, and everyone deserves credit for that. But that doesn't mean that there's not more to do. So of course there's more to do, and we will work hard at it.
But have you experienced racism yourself, and do you understand the anger a lot of people from that community of it?
Absolutely, I have. I have growing up. It stings in a way that very few other things have stung me. But the things that might have happened to me many years ago when I was a kid, I think are thankfully things that would not happen to me today, and that's because of the progress that our society and our country has made, and it's something that I'm very proud of as a country. But notwithstanding that, of course, there's always work to do. As I said, our story is not finished, but there's ways to bring about that change, and I have enormous respect for those who are doing that in a reasonable way that is not causing violence, but recognising the issues at stake.
The Chancellor talking earlier to our economics editor, Ed Conway there. Now, the scientist whose advice prompted Boris Johnson to lock down Britain has said that if the restrictions had been introduced a week earlier, the number of deaths could have been halved. Official figures show more than 40,000 deaths linked to coronavirus, and the former government advisor, Professor Neil Ferguson, said that ministers had acted too slowly. Well, I'm joined now by Professor Dame Anne Glover, who was Scotland's first chief scientific advisor. She's calling for an urgent public inquiry into the government's response to the pandemic. Very good to talk to you, Professor Glover. And that, as I just mentioned there, would be one of the big issues to be discussed by an inquiry. But tell me, first of all, why you are calling for an urgent inquiry. Why now?
I think we need it now because we have not responded well as a country to this pandemic. And I think that we might have the spectre of a second wave facing us sometime in the future. We don't know whether that will happen. And if it did happen, and especially if it were later in the year and coincided with seasonal flu, we would have a major problem to deal with. So if we had a really urgent inquiry now, we could learn from the mistakes we've made, and we could try and ensure that we can respond better if we do get a second wave, or indeed if we're faced with another similar crisis in the future.
Well, that really is a sense of urgency then, if we're talking about learning the lessons by the winter. I mean, the big question is, will there be a second wave?
Well, I don't know whether there'll be a second wave or not, but I think if we look at some of the evidence that's emerging, so in Iran there is already evidence of a second wave, so we know it's happened in one country. And I think we need to be very careful that we don't fall into a sense of complacency that that's another country, it won't happen here, because I think that kind of approach put us in the situation that we're in at the moment, in that we didn't react quickly enough to all the evidence that was going on round about us from other countries who were slightly ahead of us in being infected or showing infectious cases of coronavirus.
And that is the issue highlighted this very day by Professor Ferguson, who of course was highly influential in bringing in the lockdown, advising the government to bring it in the first place. So you no doubt that the professor is correct there, that lockdowns save lives, and the earlier the better.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look at other countries around the world, let's look at New Zealand, for example. What a great example of locking down hard and locking down early. And as a result, they have, I know, 5.5 million population, but 22 deaths. Now, the UK is currently, by most measures, looking at one of the highest death rates in the world. And that's quite hard to take. So I think what we need to do, and actually it's important, this is not always about blame. It's about identifying where you get things wrong and making sure that you do not make the same mistake twice. So I think it's very complacent when government ministers say that we've done very well and I'm proud of our response. Actually, we can't be proud of this response. We're one of a major economy in the world, and we should have responded better. So I think there is no doubt that we could, if we had locked down earlier, saved many lives.
So admit your mistakes and learn the lessons and make you more prepared next time. I mean, the other huge issue, and Professor Ferguson mentioned this today, perhaps not highlighted as much, but the number of deaths in care homes. We understand it's around about 50% of the total deaths in Scotland and England as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually that's an incredible tragedy, because we already knew that the demographic, people who are in care homes, were likely to be more susceptible to coronavirus. Therefore, we should have focused a lot of attention in protecting people in care homes, in ensuring we had enough personal protective equipment for the staff that worked there, and also that we prevented visitors, and we should have been exceptionally careful about how we dealt with people in care homes, and we haven't done that. Nor have we dealt very well with the population of people, for example, black and ethnic minority groups have also been shown to be particularly susceptible to this virus, and people with particular health conditions like diabetes, for example. We need to understand why, and we need to ensure that we are in a much better position to be able to deal with this as we go forward. But that starts with identifying that we have made mistakes and not trying to kind of gloss over it, and then dealing with that.
It's also interesting, I'm sure you've been looking at the charts more than me, the epidemiologist charts from February, March in the United Kingdom, and this has been backed up by the Danes as well, that the simple things have a huge effect as well. The early things, the hygiene, the social distancing, and the isolation and protecting of the vulnerable.
Yeah, I agree. And also, because our cases of coronavirus in the UK, if you like, came in from other countries where infection was already being spread throughout the community. So there was a piece of research published yesterday, which was jointly co-authored by scientists from University of Edinburgh and the University of Oxford, identifying, if you like, the number of times coronavirus was introduced by someone into the UK. Now, this was in February and March, potentially earlier, and they put an estimate of about 1,500 introductions. It could be twice that number. And then there was massive spread from that. And if we had gone, again, early and hard by restricting or testing people when they came into the UK, so not now, but actually right at the very beginning, then we might have been able to respond better, as indeed Denmark has.
Yeah, but in a sense, have we begun to learn those lessons now without an inquiry. You mentioned their testing, tracing and isolation. Everyone's well aware that we need to have the capabilities, the capacity, should a second wave occur, to really get stuck in on that. And of course, something we haven't mentioned, the protective equipment. We need to have plenty of that in reserve.
Yeah, and the reason that I would say that we need an urgent and rapid inquiry is that when I listen to government ministers and indeed the Prime Minister talk about our response, it seems to be in a manner that tells us that nothing has gone wrong, that we've done as well as we possibly could have done, and we're very proud of that response. And if that is truly what is felt, then I think they would benefit from having an inquiry, a rapid one, to point out where we might have done better, if they're not somehow recognising that we could have done better.
Professor Glover, it's been fantastic talking to you. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Now then, the European Union gives British farmers about £3 billion a year in subsidies. The money's designed, of course, to protect food supplies and stop farmers from losing out to foreign competitors. But from next year, the money will have to be replaced by the UK government. Gerard Tubb reports.
It's not often that decisions are taken about what our countryside should look like and how our food should be produced. But they're being taken now. The agriculture bill going through Parliament will shape the future of farming in the UK, outside the EU, for decades. Richard Pedley farms 1,200 acres in the Cumbrian uplands. Like all farmers, his share of the £3 billion of taxpayers' money that supports farming is set to change. To get subsidies, farmers will have to manage their land for the benefit of the public, over and above the production.
Well guys, if you want to see more of that programme, watch on YouTube. The phone's run out of space, near enough memory. Thank you for joining me in this video, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.